Okay, so welcome back, guys. Thoroughly missed you. I don't know how many days we are on social distancing, but I'm just gonna complete today's chapter, which is basically chapter 15. I'll post these slides online, and I'll post the video online. The link should be up there very soon, and you guys, unfortunately, we got an assignment for it. Okay. So now we're looking at mobile source air pollution control in the United States. And to combat air pollution, we need to consider mobile sources of air pollution as well. And while it's imperative to control mobile source air pollution, we need to understand that the policies and dynamics in controlling for mobile air source pollution is different from that of stationary source pollution. So the other time we looked at stationary source pollution and some sources in controlling for stationary source pollution. So, since majority of mobile air pollution is caused by individuals who tend to vote, politicians are more reluctant, or people in government to actually set up these policies. They tend to be more reluctant towards policy control for fear of facing wrath from the voters. So for them, it's quite easy to go after corporations, but not individual voters. And majority of mobile air source pollution comes from individual consumers or individual voters. So a clear example of mobile source air pollution, if you think about it right now, is, for example, cars or automobiles generating greenhouse gas emissions. Right? So we do have the mobile source program in the United States, but to actually sort of understand the mobile source air pollution control program in the United States, we sort of need to build just a simple model, and you guys don't need to memorize this model. You don't need to necessarily know the math behind it, but just know how the factors actually affect sort of the total quantity of mobile source emissions in general. Okay, so we can say the total quantity of mobile source emissions, which is actually produced, should equal the number of vehicles, okay, in the country or in a particular state, right, times the average miles traveled, okay, times the emissions per mile. Okay, so these are the three main factors that actually contribute to the total quantity of mobile source emissions, particularly from vehicles. Okay, particularly from vehicles, right? And I think vehicles generate about 90% of total quantity of mobile source emissions. So in a sense, it's good to just look at vehicles. Okay, so all these factors basically affect the quantity of mobile source emissions and the number of vehicles. Okay, so as the number of vehicles increase, so you can look at these in isolation. As the number of vehicles actually increase, we expect quantity of mobile source emissions to increase as well as number of average miles traveled increase. So long distance traveling, for example, using cars actually contribute to more greenhouse gas emissions. And also, depending on the kind of vehicle, so you have emissions per mile, right? Also affect the total quantity of mobile source emissions, right? So these three factors are what we need to consider in case of thinking of policies to actually combat mobile source emissions and trying to reduce mobile source air pollution. Well, the problem is the majority of policies are sort of oriented towards emissions per mile instead of the other two factors, and that's something we need to actually critically think of. Emissions per mile do contribute to the total quantity of mobile source emissions, but at the same time, in our model, we do have the number of vehicles and we do have the number of average miles traveled. So suppose emissions per mile, right, due to regulations or policies actually decrease, we can still have number of vehicles increasing and number of average miles actually increasing, and this will still increase the total quantity of mobile source emissions. Okay, so one mistake most politicians or government policies or government agencies actually do is just focus on emissions per mile, right? So some major elements of the mobile source pollution control program or policy in the United States, right, we have at the manufacturing level, and this is all geared towards automobiles. So automobiles or cars is what we're going to be focusing on the most. Okay, so this is geared towards automobiles. Again, they contribute about 90% of mobile source air pollution, Right, so we look at the manufacturing level, and at the manufacturing level, we have new car certification, which essentially sets emission standards on new cars that are basically produced. So there are these emission standards that every new car should follow, and that is actually federally regulated, just to try and combat the whole problem of air pollution from mobile sources or from automobiles. And we also have rules and regulations or policies at the state level, right? So at the state level, emission standards of cars do not deteriorate. Okay, so programs ensure emissions performance of cars do not decrease over time. And we call this program the inspection and maintenance. Okay, so at the state level, cars are supposed to have certain emission levels. Okay, and then we have the non-attainment areas, right? And remember, the non-attainment areas, already discussed these. These are areas considered to have air quality which is less than the national ambient air quality standards. And with these, there are policies that, a variety of technological specifications are actually put in place. Technological specification dealing with cars, fuel, and parts of the transportation system, right? So there are policies and laws that are actually put in place to try and control greenhouse gases from cars, essentially. Right, so now let's just get let's just go a little bit more into detail. Let's take a look at new car emission standards in the United States. Right, so the major emissions from mobile sources of air pollution in the United States, from cars at least, comes from carbon monoxide, or probably any sort of carbon oxides, right? So the major emission from mobile sources is carbon monoxide. And the federal approach to controlling mobile source emissions was actually set in the 1970 CAA, which is a Clean Air Act, as we talked about. And under this, we had a new car certification program, right? And under the new car certification program, we had a program of mandated emission standards of cars on new cars were actually placed. So this is around 1970. Okay, manufacturers were also set to make sure emissions of new cars do not violate mandated standards, which were actually put in place. And violation involved shutting down guilty assembly lines. So assembly lines that did not follow these new standards or emission standards were basically shut down. Okay. I think the 1970 CAA is still in effect in terms of the new car certification program, right? And majority of automobile companies, automobile industries in the United States actually follow this, because none of them obviously want their assembly line shut down, right? But the main question that we need to ask is that, again, do these policies work? So yes, it's all nice and interesting to actually come up with a policy, but is there evidence that the policies actually work? And if you actually take a look at this table, it's right from your textbook, and this table shows the emission standards established in federal law since 1970s or since the 70s. And the first row shows emissions for a typical car in 1970s or in the 70s. Let me just use my laser pointer, because why not? I can still use it, which is really cool. Okay, so this is emissions for a typical car in the 70s, right? And the new rows basically shows emissions during the last few years. And 1990, come think of 1990 is not really the last few years, it's the last 3 decades. Okay. But I think what is really astonishing and what is really interesting is the fact that emission standards have actually decreased. Emissions have actually decreased ever since the law was put in place. So evidently things are working, right? And the last row, since we passed 2017, the last row basically shows what predicted emissions should be. And it's quite evident that emission standards, especially for living carbon monoxide, has drastically decreased. Look at from 1974 to 1990, it's decreased from 28 to 3.4, right? And that is really cool. So there is some control. There is some policies that are actually working to actually reduce greenhouse gases. I guess the main question then is the reduction fast enough? So yes, there is reduction, but is the reduction fast enough to actually prevent climate change? And that's something we probably need to consider, and that's something you guys can actually consider or think about in terms of your research, right? Emission standards emissions from mobile source have decreased, but is it decreasing fast enough to actually reduce climate change? And I think that's the next frontier. That's the next question we need to sort of think about. Right, and as usual with everything, we have critics, and there are some people actually oppose these sort of mandated mobile source air pollution mandated programs, and the main critics are from the automobile industry, and they argue that it's largely unrealistic and stringent, so these policies tend not to be pragmatic. They argue that the cost associated with trying to come up with new technology to find, better gas mileage or trying to improve the emission standards from their cars is unrealistic, is not pragmatic, it's not really practical. And some of these policies are also stringent in the sense that you can easily close down the shop. You can easily close down the assembly line or the manufacturer. So basically, they sort of oppose this, and they argue that there should be other ways in which to sort of actually control for emissions from mobile sources. And that's something really interesting. But as usual, we have advocates, and the advocates argue that this actually creates an incentive. Actually, putting in the strict and sort of stringent policies creates an incentive for the automobile industry to search for new methods of creating or trying to reduce basically the total quantity of emissions we have from mobile source air pollution. And we call this technology forcing, right? So the laws, right, basically force, in a way, companies to come up with new emission effective ways of actually controlling for new emissions, right? So you do have critics who actually say these these rules are too strict and unrealistic, and then you do have those people who actually sort of support these laws and argue that it's actually best for society as a whole, and economic benefits will actually increase. Okay, and your textbook actually gives more details. Again, I would stress that you try and read your textbook, chapter 15. Just go through it. And again, if you don't understand anything or there's something that is confusing, please send me questions. I think chapter 15 is quite an easy read because majority of the information there is informative, so you can easily learn from it. But again, if you're confused about anything, send me questions or send me an email, and I'll be more than happy to reply to your emails. Okay. Another component of the mobile source air pollution control program is the current invention of clean cars, and we're seeing that more often. The thinking behind clean cars is that if emissions per mile can be reduced, then total emissions will be reduced, even if the total number of cars and total miles driven keep on increasing. So remember our equation where we have the total number of cars times the total miles driven times the emissions per mile is actually all contributing to total quantity of emissions in the atmosphere from mobile sources. So with the clean cars, right, you're trying to reduce emissions per mile and at the same time accelerate the total number of cars and total miles driven. And one sort of solution they've come up with is, having electric cars, which actually supposedly is not supposed to, or supposedly does not produce any greenhouse gas emissions. Right, I want you guys to think of some problems with electric cars, right? The technology behind electric cars is quite difficult to replicate. It's not as easy as it seems. Yes, you do have the Teslas and you do have a couple of cars or a couple of manufacturers actually going for it. But the technology behind them is really costly. It's really costly for the industry to actually produce them. And at the same time, since it's costly for producers to actually make electric cars, it's quite expensive, right? So they really price that at sort of an amount where a few people can actually afford it to some extent. So the main thing that most producers and consumers have basically settled on is the hybrid technology. So hybrid technology has mainly been sort of embraced by automakers or producers in the automobile industry. And that actually reduces emissions quite a bit, and at the same time is not as costly to actually research hybrid technology. Neither is it as costly to actually produce hybrid cars, and in a way the prices for hybrid cars are not as high. I was going to say exorbitant as electric cars, but I don't think the price differential is that much. But it's not as high as electric cars, so consumers obviously lean towards it and feel more comfortable towards it. And the government has also placed a whole lot of subsidies, or there are a whole lot of subsidies and discount rates or discounts on hybrid cars to actually make them more easily accessible in terms of production and in terms of people actually affording them, in terms of consumers actually being able to buy them. And this is supposed to sort of reduce emissions per mile. But then you still have the conundrum which you guys need to think about. That the fact is total number of cars and total miles driven will keep on increasing. So you might probably reduce emissions per mile. But then if the total number of cars actually increase or total miles driven actually increase, right, you're still actually in a way polluting the environment, right? So electric cars are sort of the future and they are sort of the way to go in terms of controlling for emissions. However, the technology behind it is still a bit difficult to actually reproduce, at least on a mass scale. So it's still hung up, in terms of actually looking at it, or in terms of consumers or producers actually embracing it. Okay. Well, the next thing we'll look at is climate change. And we all know climate change has become a major issue. We've seen the statistics on climate change already. It's an inevitable sort of fact that our climate is actually warming up. And has become a major issue, and there are many policies that are trying to solve it. There are many questions that have been risen from climate change. Many countries around the world have also come together and imposed some sort of greenhouse gas restrictions on vehicles to try and curb climate change, which is pretty much commendable. Okay, but a major federal policy in the United States concerning climate change and mobile source standards has been that of what we call CAFE, and CAFE basically is corporate average fuel economy, right? And this was largely set in 1970. Okay, and the main aim was basically trying to reduce petroleum imports in the United States. So initially when CAFE was set up, it was trying to sort of inhibit or mitigate or decrease the number of petroleum imports into the United States. And the idea was basically to reduce the major source of CO2 emissions, which is petroleum. So long as there's a reduction of petroleum into the United States, the whole assumption behind this, right, is that people won't buy as much vehicles or cars that actually require so much fuel or so much gas, and by doing so the total emissions per mile driven will actually reduce, and by reducing that you basically reduce greenhouse gas emissions, which actually contribute to climate change, right? So that was the whole point of CAFE, and there's been evidence which shown that CAFE to some extent has actually, yes, improved or reduced actually climate change and reduced greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, but then we need to think about the economic issues behind this, and as a major part of deciding policies, as we economists know, is basically to analyze the long run benefits and costs of these standards. Okay, so what are the benefits? Again, the marginal benefits is what we think about. What are the marginal benefits of actually introducing a program? And at the same time, what's the marginal cost of actually introducing that program? Okay, and to actually estimate the marginal benefits and the marginal cost, at least in the long run, we need to estimate and predict the future mix of cars that will be built, purchased, and used by consumers. Okay, so an interesting thing is that before 2011, all cars, which is something interesting and something you should know. Before 2011, all cars of different types were held to the same standards, which you think shouldn't be the case because you have different cars and different models and different makeups and what have you. But before 2011, all cars of different types were held to the same standard, even with the CAFE rule or program. But as of 2011, which happened, I'll say recently or 9 years ago, as of 2011, CAFE standards were tightened, and different types of cars, in terms of size, were given different standards, right? Which is, I think, is more pragmatic, especially in today's world where you have different types of cars, different automobile models being made. And things we actually need to consider in terms of economic issues also are behavioral factors such as decisions individuals make as to when, how to basically travel. Okay, so then we have one major thing that we call the rebound effect. And the rebound effect is an interesting theory which arises from environmental economics. Right, and it says that a car with better gas mileage means the cost of traveling long distances have been reduced. So yes, this car with better gas mileage won't use as much fuel, will reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and the cost of traveling for long distances, you basically have a better gas mileage, has actually reduced, right? But remember, in economics, we say individuals are rational behaviors and they try to minimize their cost as much as possible. Thereby, with better gas mileage and the cost of traveling long distances being reduced or going in reduction, individuals end up driving more distances, which is going to worsen the total miles driven vehicles. And again, going back to our equation, the total miles driven actually in a way increases the total quantity of emissions produced. Okay, so even though people are actually sort of buying these efficient cars to some extent, right, they actually tend to travel more and sort of introduce emissions into the atmosphere, right? In a way, it can cause emissions which have been produced into the atmosphere to be worse, hence the rebound effect. Okay, hence what we call the rebound effect. The rebound in the sense that yes, people are actually buying cars with better gas mileage, reducing emissions, but then there's a rebound in the sense that people are actually driving long distances and now emissions are actually increasing. Okay. Another concept that we need to think about in terms of economics is known as the energy efficiency gap. Right, so one thing we should know is that buying cars, and I actually bought a car recently, so I do know this for a fact, buying cars with better mileage tend to be more costly than cars with low mileage. Okay, so buying a better mileage car has high costs initially, but in the long run, individuals or consumers save up on costs through reduced energy consumption. Okay, so initial costs are really high, but in the long run, you actually save up on energy costs. And in the long run, if you actually look at the totality of everything, right, your cost or the total cost are actually better off or actually reduced or lower than if you actually buy a car with low gas mileage, right? We already know that buying cars with high gas mileage actually is good for the environment as well, right? But the interesting thing is that research has actually shown, so this is research done by environmental economists, right? And it's actually shown that even though consumers have lower costs through the reduction in energy costs, so that in totality their costs are actually lower in the long run, they are still hesitant to make an investment on better mileage cars, which is pretty interesting, right? So in the long run, their costs are actually going to be lower, right? But they are still hesitant in actually buying these better mileage cars, and we call this the energy efficiency gap. Okay, so it's a theory where consumers are reluctant to purchase full efficient cars due to the high initial cost. Okay, so majority of people or majority of individuals, for some reason, do not look at the long-term cost, but they always look at the short-term cost. Okay, so they tend to be myopic in actually looking at the total cost of the vehicles. Okay, so then we actually get this problem known as the energy efficiency gap. Okay, So why, in a way, do you think people actually look at the initial cost and hence do not purchase as much fuel efficient cars, right? Then instead of looking at the long-term cost and hence should purchase as much efficient cars. I want you guys to, I'll probably stop here and give you maybe 5 seconds just to think about reasons why the energy efficiency gap might exist. Okay, so one main reason is because consumers, for some reason, tend to miscalculate future savings in energy costs. So they don't think they'll probably get as much savings as they actually will. Okay, so there's this discrepancy between consumers actually miscalculating what the entire cost of the car will be, and hence they're actually reluctant to actually pay for that. Because remember, in terms of actually paying for a car with the initial high cost, in the next few years, you actually need to pay really high amounts of money, and consumers sort of miscalculate the future sort of benefits, the future long-term benefits in terms of total cost reductions when actually paying for these cars, and because of that, they actually do not go for fuel efficient cars. Hence, we have the energy efficient gap. Okay, another reason, which is to no fault of theirs or to some consumers, is the fact that they lack access to credit to make front purchases. Okay, so then they are put off by these highly expensive cars. And a third reason is that consumers do not always behave as rational agents. So in economics, we always assume that consumers behave as rational agents, that if they actually know every single information to them, they will actually pick the car, which in the long run is going to save them a lot of money. But for some reason, right, there could be so many factors. There could be a copious amount of factors. There could be a plethora of factors. Consumers will not behave as rational agents and might want to pick a low gas mileage car, maybe because they just feel maybe the interior looks good, or they feel like it runs really good, or it just looks really nice. Okay, so we can't always assume that consumers behave rationally according to economics. Okay, some consumers might actually behave irrational, and that is the whole point of the field of behavioral economics, which actually studies why consumers do not always behave as rational. Okay, and the last thing is that consumers have this uncertainty about the future, and hence it induces them to actually save now. So consumers are not sure about how the future might look in terms of job security, in terms of the economy, in terms of the money they have. So instead of actually going for a high initial cost, because remember with these better gas mileage cars, you actually end up saving in the long term in the future, right? Initially, yes, the costs are high, but you eventually end up saving in the future, right? And some consumers are not really certain about how their future will look like, so they prefer to buy a low sort of fuel efficient car or a non-fuel efficient car to actually end up saving some extra money just in case of, maybe some future disaster where they might actually need cash. Okay, so these are some of the reasons we economists have come up with in terms of why there's the energy efficiency gap. Again, if you don't understand anything, please send me an email. I'll be more than happy to elaborate and help you out. Okay, again, I'll suggest you read the textbook as well. Right, and finally, we're going to look at solutions to the energy efficiency gap. So what do you think are some solutions to the energy efficiency gap? And I want you guys to think about this. I'll give you 10 seconds. Just try and think about some solutions to how we can basically stop the energy efficiency gap. Well, so the first approach is to put a higher tax on gasoline, right? So the whole concept is that, or the whole theory or understanding behind this is that if you actually put a higher tax on gasoline or petroleum, gas becomes significantly costly Then you actually force, or you give consumers the incentives. So remember, economics is all about incentives. You give consumers the incentive to think more of their driving habits if gas is actually expensive, and hence you give them an incentive to shift towards more fuel efficient cars, hence bridging or closing that energy efficiency gap. Okay, another way or another factor, right, is to also basically, oh, and one more thing I want to talk about with higher tax of gasoline is that higher gasoline taxes will also lead to less traffic congestion. So less traffic congestion means total number of cars driven is less, and total miles driven is also less. Hence, the total quantity of emissions will reduce. Okay, and finally, we want to talk about charge vehicle emissions directly as a solution, right? So due to state, and this has been done before, and is more pragmatic into some extent, right? So due to state level I&M programs, okay, so I&M is basically inspection and maintenance. Okay, so I&M programs, total mileage that a vehicle has driven can be recorded. So since the total mileage that a vehicle has been driven can be recorded, the total mileage is then multiplied by emissions per mile to give an estimate of total emissions, right? So this will create an incentive to explore ways in which total emissions driven by each car can be reduced, okay, through taxation or maybe charging a fee, right? And in a way, this will reduce total miles driven and induce people to drive more fuel efficient cars as well. Okay, so these are the two solutions that can basically bridge the the energy efficiency gap. Okay, so guys, this is where we'll basically finish our chapter. Okay, so we just looked at federal air pollution control policy in the United States. There's a whole lot more. Okay, again, I will actually encourage you to read your textbook, and at the same time, if you don't understand anything, please ask me questions. Okay, I miss you guys a lot, and I can't really wait to see you again. Stay safe. Just remember to wash your hands, and yeah, I'll see you probably. Well, I'll see you guys in September, but technically, I'll see you. Through the video. We'll talk later, or I'll lecture again with the next chapter, which is going to be our final chapter for the semester. Okay, well, take care.